everybody, welcome to History Room Live. History Room Live is a program from the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at Patent Free Library. You're joining us on a rainy Friday afternoon, and we're here today with Alison Hepler, who's going to speak about her book, McCarthyism in the Suburbs. Alison is a Woolwich resident. She is the state rep for House District 53. She's a selectman for the town of Woolwich. She's a board member for Patent Free Library, the Woolwich Historical Society, and Maine's Worship. So I'm very pleased that she's taken the time to be here today because she's obviously a very busy person. In addition to all those roles, she is also a history professor in the UMaine system. And in 2018, she published the book that we're going to be speaking about today. We'll start with a quick presentation by Alison, and then I have a few questions for her, and then we'll move into a question and answer session with the audience. So, Alison, I want to thank you for being here today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for being here. I was telling Jill on the way in that it's a good thing this is on Zoom because nobody would come in person on a day like today. So this is great because it kind of melds my history and library interests into one. So I'm just going to do a probably 15-minute overview and happy to answer any questions in more detail. And then we're going to talk about how we do history and then open it to questions. So in 1953, Mary Knowles was a librarian for the public library in Norwood, Massachusetts, which was south of Boston. She was called before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, similar to the House Un-American Activities Committee, but on the Senate side, asked if she'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. She declined to answer, and 3 weeks she was fired from her job. She thought she was unlikely to find a position as a librarian again, and she left the area. And somewhat surprisingly, she got a job at a small library outside of Philadelphia. And within a few months, the same sort of anti-communist charges emerged, this time over a loyalty oath. Here, by the time it was over, what started as a local disagreement had brought national attention to the religious organization of Quakers, who had hired her, from the FBI, 2 congressional investigations, and a nonprofit group that had awarded the Quakers for their position. And this is a picture of her. In this book, I wanted to examine the impact of McCarthyism on small towns and its impact on ordinary people. McCarthyism lasted a long time, long after Joseph McCarthy left the scene. We know about McCarthyism in broad strokes, but to me, the story is in the details. And so I think this story is probably just one example of the varieties of anti-communism that affected not only neighborhoods across the nation, but ordinary people with families to support, like Mary Knowles. I'm going to start here in 1944 when Knowles got a job at the Sam Adams School for Social Studies. It was one of several schools across the country that had been founded in the 1930s, funded primarily by the Communist Party. So in addition to adult education for working class people that was free, there were some courses on Marxism that were thrown in. She was initially hired to be, she'd been trained as a librarian, actually at Bates College. And in fact, and her expertise was as a children's librarian. And even though this was an adult education program, she was originally hired to teach a story hour class on Saturday mornings for the kids of the people who were attending. She then became the school's secretary. This is actually an example from her FBI file, which we can talk about later. But because the school was funded primarily by the Communist Party, aggression invited the attention of the FBI, other folks, the Attorney General's office, and so most of these schools had closed by the late 40s. This one closed in 1948, and she was able to get a job in Norwood, Massachusetts, at the public library there. She, by this time, was divorced and was the full-time supporter of her teenage son. So she became the branch librarian in the South Norwood area of the town. This was in a tenement building. This was an immigrant community full of Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Syrians, who were working in the factories there. She provided here's a picture of the inside of the library. It opened directly across the street from the elementary school. And for immigrant families, this was, of course, a strong place an important place for their kids to learn. Reading was really important. The kids seemed to love her. Mary Knowles worked closely with families, parents, teachers, and also worked with local business people who were interested in perhaps starting businesses of their own, spoke to a lot of local groups. So now enter Herbert Philbrick. Some of you may be aware of him. He would have been an FBI informant in the 1940s and became a public, kind of gave up his informant role in 1951 when he testified in a sedition trial for some people from the Boston area. He also wrote so then he went on to become this sort of professional anti-communist. He also led so he wrote this book. He also had a TV show in the 1950s. He knew a lot of people because of his years as an informant. He could identify a lot of people. He was widely popular in Massachusetts. The governor even held a Herbert Philbrick Day. Philbrick identified two friends of Knowles who were later indicted for sedition. And later that year, the FBI wanted to interview Knowles to see probably, what she knew about these people and whether she wanted to talk to them. As you can tell from this report, she did not want to talk to the FBI. She indicated an uncooperative attitude, which not only, which kept her on the FBI's radar. They were willing, because they hadn't heard anything about her since 1948, they were willing to take her off their list. But because of this, she didn't want to identify, she didn't want to talk about her friends or her family. So she was kept on the list, which looks like this, a security index card. She then told her boss, who was up at the main branch at the Morrill Memorial Library, the director of the library and the president of the board of trustees said, you don't need to resign, because Knowles had offered to resign. They also didn't tell the board of trustees about all of this. So Philbrick went on to expose Knowles in 1953 in a Boston examination of subversion and education in the Boston area. He identified her as the secretary to the school. She seems to have been caught unaware by his testimony and again offered to resign. Once again, her director and the president of the board of trustees publicly defended her. They suspended her with pay pending her appearance before the Senate committee, which she did 2 weeks later in Washington, D.C. It was brief, even though she was invited by the senator who chaired the committee to, this is your chance to explain, to wipe away any of this taint of communism. She declined to answer any questions using her Fifth Amendment constitutional protection. This was something that a lot of people in her situation were doing at this time. The hearing, not surprisingly, received a lot of press in the Boston area and in the newspapers as well. So the meeting of the Board of Trustees was probably not a surprise. And so I put this up as an example of the kind of thinking that was widespread in America as well as in Norwood during this time, a desire for conformity and uniformity regarding patriotism. The trustees did meet with Knowles. They met behind closed doors and they ended up firing her. But I also want to show you that Knowles her views represented a different attitude that existed also in America. Unfortunately, for people like her, if you expressed it publicly, this led to unfortunate circumstances. And in this case, they had to fire her. She had withdrawn her offer to resign. So this was what they did. This was praised by the media in Norwood. She stayed throughout the summer, but she was not likely to find a job in the area. So she moved to Philadelphia, the Philadelphia area, moving in with another divorced, a female friend who had also had a teenage child. She found a job at this tiny little library called the William Jeanes Memorial Library in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania. It was a temporary full-time job. It was the public library, even though it was run by the Quakers. They offered her, like I said, a temporary full-time job. She told the library committee what her background was with the Senate committee, and they hired her anyway. Again, it was probably an 8 or 9 month job. The issue for the public was that even though this was run by Quakers, which were not a public organization, for a couple of years prior to this, they had started taking money from the public entities, the surrounding towns in the area, as well as the school board. And one of the township commissioners wanted a oath of loyalty. Pennsylvania had just passed a loyalty oath that was required for all public employees. This was not a public place of employment. Knowles, as well as the Quakers, rejected loyalty oaths, but Knowles did submit a notarized statement, which pretty much said everything that was on the loyalty oath. She was a good librarian and kids loved her. And it was clear that the library committee wanted to hire her permanently. They knew that this would probably mean the withdrawal of public funding for this, but they had the support of the meeting when they asked if they could hire her permanently. And like I said, this is what the kind of publicity that the library committee put out for in support of Knowles. So they met with the Plymouth Township commissioners met a month later. This is the loyalty oath that they wanted her to swear to. Lots of people came to this meeting with the commissioners wanting to know why this was an issue. She'd already expressed her loyalty. The librarian wasn't even required to do this. They met, I think the public meeting lasted about 4 hours. The commissioners did not do much other than vaguely refer to Knowles as a security risk. And, but the next month they voted to end the public support financial support of the library, along with the 2 other towns and the school board. I have to say, as a local official, I kind of now feel for these people a little bit. So a few months later, it was clear that Knowles was going to be staying on at the library. A local citizen by the name of Helen Corson, and I apologize for the photo, it's the only one I have of her. Helen Corson, and that picture is available because she was a state championship golfer. She started a very public campaign to fire the librarian. She wrote and distributed a lot of newsletters, running them off in her own little mimeograph machine down in what the newspapers called her powder room in her house in Plymouth Meeting. She said that, as you see here, that the fact that Knowles was well qualified was proof of her subversiveness, that she was inappropriately employed as a security risk, that the fact that children adored her was further proof of her communist ties, because that allowed her to infiltrate, indoctrinate children. And then her decision to take such a low-paying job was further of suspicion. Corson was energetic and focused and remarkably effective at getting her message out. She was very single-minded. I did not get a chance to talk to her, any of her family. None of them were alive, and she didn't seem to leave many records other than these public newsletters. Corson's work got the attention of a group called the Fund for the Republic. They had heard, it was a nonprofit organization, actually a subsidiary of the Ford Foundation. They had heard of the library's financial problems and they wanted to help with that. They also wanted to honor the library and the meeting for their courage in continuing to keep Mary Knowles on. As a result of this, because it's a nonprofit tax-exempt organization, this prompted then 2 congressional committees, one before the Senate and one before the House. This became a national issue. The first committee, the Senate committee that Knowles had faced earlier, subpoenaed her, asked her to questions that she didn't use the Fifth Amendment to decline to answer. She refused to answer questions as she viewed as outside the authority of the committee. She was convicted of 52 counts of contempt of Congress, one for every question she refused to answer, and she faced jail time. She was free because the pending appeals moving through the courts. Also, and this is where this picture comes from, the House Un-American Activities Committee called members of the Quaker meeting to a committee in Philadelphia and to ask them about this fund for the Republic and why were they using money to fund communists. When I think of scary communists, I often think of this picture because she looks anything but scary with her pearls and her glasses, and yeah. So a couple of things I want to also mention is that it was hard on the Friends meeting. This is a picture of Plymouth Friends Meeting House. They hadn't even agreed to accept the $5,000. Quakers, if you don't know, operate on a decision-making policy known as unity. It's sort of like consensus, but it's stronger than consensus. And it took 2 years and monthly meetings for business. Not necessarily in the meetings for worship, but during their monthly meetings for business, this came up at every meeting for 2 years. It caused a lot of division, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of dismay, and Friends were repeatedly, when you look at their minutes, Friends repeatedly pleaded with each other to be polite. This is not something we're used to thinking about as friends. The other thing I want to mention here is the community. This got a lot of negative attention. It was a lot of criticism from the meeting. And that's what we tend to see when we think about McCarthyism. But it's important to note that other people in the community, in the wider community, expressed their views differently. They sent money to the library, and the Friends of the library. They wrote letters of encouragement to Mary Knowles and to the meeting. They continued to bring their children, even though the school was forbidden to take kids to the library, they continued to take their kids to the library. So there's a lot of private actions that don't necessarily get a lot of attention. And the other thing I'll say sort of in private action is that Mary Knowles herself except in court, she didn't say anything. She just continued to do the job for which she was hired. The library committee recognized that by raising her pay after she was convicted of contempt of Congress. And the library use also increased steadily during this period. It was an exciting time to be here, a lot of young families here. The other thing I want to mention is the FBI's role in all of this. We tend to think, at least I tend to think of the FBI as this sort of dogged, like we always get our man kind of approach. And here, what you see in the Philadelphia area are local agents who did not want to get involved in this local controversy. They would watch and they would look at newspapers and they would answer the phone if somebody called, but they did not want to get involved. And oftentimes you see them in their records pushing back against Washington who was more aggressive. At one point, for instance, the library FBI in Washington, Hoover, frankly, wanted them to interview the members of the library committee, and the FBI agents in Philly said, no, we can't do that because we rely on discretion. And if we interview them, they're going to tell everybody. Besides, one of the library committee members has Mary Knowles over for lunch every day, and another one has called these hearings, these congressional hearings, the red herring hearings. So let's just back off. And so you see a lot of tension between Washington and the Philadelphia agents. So in 1960, the Court of Appeals overturned Knowles's conviction and some others who were similarly situated, basically saying that congressional investigating committees can't just call people in willy-nilly and just ask them questions. They actually had to be pertinent to whatever they were investigating. So this was a happy ending for Knowles and for the library, even though this continued to come up over the years. And I think about some of the issues, like why this happened. Why didn't this happen in Norwood? And there's a couple of things. I think nationally, we were 2 or 3 years now past, several years past the fall of Joseph McCarthy. I think the voices were certainly there, but they were less shrill. Also, Plymouth Meeting was a rapidly growing suburban community, lots of young children, increased reliance on the library. I think sort of related to that is, in Boston in 1951, there was Herbert Philbrick Day. This was 9 or 10 years later. And I think regionally, this was also fading in Philadelphia. Philadelphia also had a number of lawyers who were attacking this problem of people being accused of sedition and McCarthyism, anti-communism. Also, I want to give credit to the Friends meeting itself. It's not unreasonable to think that their actions, not used to being in the public eye, contributed to the decline in hysteria. The meeting itself deserves a lot of credit. They wrestled privately with this decision and this division within the community. And even though it was tough, people stayed in the fight, basically. Although I don't like to use the word fight with Quakers who were pacifists. It really shows us how Quaker decision-making works during tough times. In some ways, it's easy during easier times. The Quakers, of course, the town of Plymouth Meeting was actually named for the Quakers. So, I mean, they're very much at the heart of this community. And Mary Knowles herself, she was a single mom, could have gone to jail, stood up for what she thought was important, and remained the librarian even after the library moved into the financial support of the local municipalities. I think, one of the things I think she learned from Norwood is that she had a way of winning people over and used that to her advantage in Lafayette and Plymouth Meeting. It was a community of young mothers who would bring their kids to the library, and she would hire those young mothers to work for her part-time. And so she kind of created a wall of safety and security, people who wouldn't speak up in public necessarily, but they were there. They even gave her a party after her conviction was overturned, even with a small red carpet. So she, like I said, she retired from this job. She retired in 1979, and even after the towns took full responsibility. For me, the lessons here are about what we can learn from people who, in times of fear, face it honestly and with integrity. Not only Knowles, but also the community members, the Quakers. Some people acted with their words, and some people with their deeds. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have written this book and learned so much from them. So that's sort of some of what happened.
Well, thank you, Alison. That's such an interesting story, and there's so many different aspects of it that where somebody could learn something about McCarthyism, about librarianship, about the Quaker meeting. All of those are, well, things that I didn't know a lot about, and now I want to know more. So one of the reasons that I asked Alison to speak on this topic is because this is an interesting story about libraries, but it's also because she has so much knowledge to share about the process of conducting historical research using archival materials that are not unlike the materials that we have here in the history room. So I wanted her to have a chance to tell us about how she discovered this story, some of the methods that she used. So Alison, if I could start by asking you, how did you learn about this story? And what was your first step in getting started on this journey?
Well, actually, my late husband and his sister, who's my best friend, grew up with Mary Knowles as their librarian. And so I first learned about this story from them. Also, when Bobby and I, my first husband and I, started attending the Friends meeting, we learned about it. We learned the name Mary Knowles. I didn't know anything about her. I didn't know that the building on the meeting house grounds had been the library. But when we mentioned it to some, and because nobody talked about it, Quakers have this, habit of being quiet, and sometimes to their disadvantage, right? Because they didn't want, once this was over, nobody really wanted to talk about it. But we met a couple in the Friends meeting who, when we said, we thought this would be a cool joint project to do. And we said, we mentioned this to Barbara and Leon Cooter, regular members of the meeting, and they said, this is great. We have stuff for you. Now, this is not the way historians find stuff. They have to go out and go to libraries like the Patent Free Library and try to hunt down stuff. Nobody hands you stuff. So they handed us a pile of Helen Corson's newsletters, about, yay thick, plus a whole lot of very carefully preserved local newspaper articles, which, there were a lot more local papers then than there are now. And so they saved me a lot of time. And so that was actually, these newsletters was the first way that I got started. We took it, we were going to do a joint writing project. Bob died a year later unexpectedly. And so for a lot of other reasons too, but I just put it away for a number of years. When I first started writing about it about 4 years later, I gave a talk at UMF about, just a very initial story. I had not done really much any research except for these newsletters and these newspaper articles. And then 6 months later, due to the joy of the internet, I got an email from somebody named Jonathan Knowles. He said, she was my mom. And I didn't know he existed. People don't call you and say, I'm, related to the person who you were interested in. So those were the first two places that I got started. And then what you do is you find your sources by reading whatever else is written about the topic, right? Sometimes it's not going to be Knowles. There was very little written about this. But you read about McCarthyism, you read about Quakers, you read about libraries, you read about, how the Library Association dealt with Quakers. And then you look at the footnotes. This is what I tell my students, right? You look at the footnotes, you see where they got their information, and then you follow up with that. And so you slowly collect notes and archives, and it shouldn't have taken 20 years for me to do this, but it did. And it shouldn't take anybody 20 years. There's a project that you kind of pick up and then you let go and then you pick up again. And so, yeah.
You were lucky in that you were situated in the community in such a way that you had these local connections to kind of tip you off and get you started.
Yeah.
And then to learn more, you were reading and reading and reading and using some of the same sources that your sources used, but maybe in a different way.
Yeah. Exactly. That's what it is. I mean, I was reading a book about libraries. I wasn't necessarily, actually one of the books, for instance, was a book about a woman who was fired for putting things, she was a librarian in Oklahoma, putting things in the library about civil rights and desegregation. So it was not a story about McCarthyism and anti-communism, but it was still, I kind of used that model for like what kinds of places do you look for articles, right? You look at some of the local papers. Maybe there's minutes from the library, which actually I was able to find in this case. And so you use it for, I wasn't interested in her story, but looking at the footnotes of how people used other sources was a way for me to figure out what other sources I might use, even if they're not mentioned directly, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And once you found those sources, how did you decide if they were going to be useful to you or if they were reliable, if you could trust the information that was in them?
That's a really good question. One of the things that I think about, it's obviously helpful to cross-check. One of the things that happened when I was reading the congressional testimony from some of the people who were hostile to keeping the librarian, claimed he didn't know anything about, he had been on the library committee, he didn't know anything about her past, which if you go back and look at what he'd said in the newspapers a couple of years earlier, of course he did. He told people that he knew that, and that's why he had wanted her to take this loyalty oath. So you kind of, you have to sort of double check, see which one. Actually, I think in the case of this book, I think I used both of them to sort of say, he said this a couple of years later, but he also said this, and try to come up with a likely explanation. Sometimes you can match private correspondence with public reports. Sometimes, and this is something that I learned when I was doing research on the the Quaker meeting minutes themselves, is there's a whole year of records from the Plymouth Friends meeting that are gone. They never made it to the archives at Swarthmore College. They, and we don't know whether they were deliberate, and this was the year where they finally decided to accept the $5,000. I don't know whether the person who had the files thought that just the discussion was so acrimonious that he just could not in good conscience place them in public records, or he also had a reputation of keeping a lot of things in his house. I'm not going to use the H word, but and they could have just been tossed accidentally, who knows. But there, I actually had to rely on the newspaper reports, which again are kind of unusual that newspapers would be covering what happens in Quaker meetings. Oral histories are great. That's where I first got started. I have a hard time getting started with them because I always feel like I'm intruding on people's lives. But they were a great source in many cases. In other cases, they weren't, because I'm interviewing the children of the people who were involved, because this had all happened 50 years earlier. And so some of that information, I know their memory was, and also you're interviewing somebody 50 years later and they were a teenager, maybe not had anything to do with what their parents were doing. So, yeah.
So you, thank you.
So, I guess the other thing is the level of detail that I found in the Plymouth Friends meeting minutes gave me confidence that they were pretty accurate reflections, because also the following month, like every other organization, the minutes have to be approved. So I give them credit for, so that gives me some confidence in their reliability.
So you looked at the way the records were created to think about whether you wanted to use them.
I think about that as a secretary for a couple of organizations, right?
Yeah.
As a historian, I want those records to be accurate. So, yeah.
There's apparently a lot to consider, and you also kind of touched on the idea of presenting the reader with the evidence and letting them decide, saying,
yeah,
well, he said this then, and he said this now, and
yeah,
how can we know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The other funny story I just remembered quickly about the oral histories is that even though this was all over by 1960, every time something about the library came up in the news, somebody would stand up and say, oh, is this the woman who's accused of being a communist? And one of my favorite interviews was with a guy who had been involved in hiring an architect for the library building, that actually the picture that you see here. And people didn't, this was a modern looking, you can tell this is a pretty modern looking building. Lafayette Hill and Plymouth Meeting were very traditional Revolutionary War era colonial towns. And so there was controversy about the library over architect. And I'll never forget, they had, bake sales to raise money for this. And he said to me, pies were thrown. It's like, not really thrown, but sort of tipped off the table so that they fell and smashed to pieces. So there's, the library brought out a lot of intense interest, and we see that here. People care about the patent-free library. When they're in the news, people care. Like when the building was broken into and the bottle of change, people really rallied around it. They care. So.
They do, and that's always,
even if we don't throw pies,
usually very positive. So you visited a lot of archives. You used private archives, like in the case of the Quaker family that you mentioned first. Possibly, I'm sorry, I said private archives, but I meant personal archives.
Right.
Possibly you used private archives of maybe organizations who hadn't made their records public, and you used public archives in public libraries and university libraries in many places, as well as government archives. So what was your favorite of all of those places?
Well, one of my favorites actually was not involved with this process, but with a previous book that I wrote. At the National Archives, I went in to look at photographs, and the documents they gave me, there were rules for researchers. And one of them was, researchers may not stand on the tables. I'm glad I worked in a place where the researchers were not allowed to be on the tables. So, but that itself has a history of it, but that's beside the point. The Library of Congress was interesting, not so much for the space, although it's always nice to be in Washington, D.C., and I could take the train down to Union Station. Library of Congress is just 4 or 5 blocks from Union Station, so I could do a day trip or a couple of day trip. Herbert Philbrick, not a person that had 103 boxes of stuff. Fortunately, it was very well indexed, and so I only had to use the part. I could tell which parts I needed to use. But one of the things I found there is a surprising correspondence between him and the librarian who Knowles had replaced. She was not happy about. I don't think she was happy about being displaced, but she was displaced, and sort of anyway, it was a surprising conversation from a woman that I thought had gone away, at least in my story, a long time ago. Specialized libraries, it's a place often where you don't have to, people won't bother you because they're doing their own stuff. But what was nice about Swarthmore Library, which is a repository for many Quaker collections, is that there are people there who are familiar with Quaker history and Quaker process, so that was helpful. The FBI files, which you can get, anybody can get through the Freedom of Information Act, provided me 1,000 pages of documents on Knowles. The other thing, I guess, that gets back to your reliability question is that some stuff that shows up in a couple of different archives, like Helen Corson's newsletters, when they show up also in the FBI files, as well as the Fund for the Republic archives, you can kind of rely on them if lots of people are collecting them, and so they're out there in the public eye, if that makes sense. I think, yeah, for some, it was actually, I was able to combine a trip out to Illinois to the American Library Association archives with a visit to some family I had in Chicago. So
it sounds like it's hard to pick a favorite.
Yeah, it is, yeah. They all have their charm.
That's good. Of the archives I've visited myself, I don't think I could pick one favorite aside from this one.
I'd love to ask that question to other historians.
So this story is about Mary Knowles, but it's also about a library community, a Quaker community, and the nation as a whole. So how do you decide what the story is that you're telling?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because for instance, at certain times in history, like if there's a 200th birthday of some famous person, you have 8 biographies of one person. It's like, how can there be that much to say, to take up 8 books? And so part of it is, what do you have for a story? Like what information do you actually have, right? And then, so is it, do you have a lot of material about who Mary Knowles was? Do you have material about Quakers? And so it becomes like, it's initially started out to me as a biography, and then it's like, some noise just happened here. Is it a comparison of 2 libraries? Why did this happen in Norwood but not in Plymouth Meeting? Sometimes it's a book. It's like, is this a book on Quaker decision making? Because that took up a lot of my time and energy. It's a gendered look at the 1950s. I'm a historian of women. I mean, a lot of the leaders in all of this on both sides were females. How can you not do that? And then finally, what I landed on is, what was McCarthyism like for small towns? We have it sort of writ large in movies and in Hollywood and whatnot, but how did it affect ordinary people in small towns? And that's sort of what I landed on. And I think sort of related to that, there's a who am I? Because there's a relationship between the past and the present, right? It's not just a story about McCarthyism from 70 years ago now. I'm a women's historian. I'm also a local official. How does that affect what I see as important? I also am a member of a beloved library. How does that affect how I see this? I'm a friend to some of these people. I'm actually a member of that Quaker meeting. I actually got married. My first wedding was at that friends meeting. How does that affect what I know about, and then also contemporary events. I gave my first public talk about this right after 9/11. And the story about sort of this cute little local community became something that had resonance with people who were suspected of not being patriotic. That has reared its ugly head in recent years as well. And so that also affects how you look back at the past.
Well, it certainly sounds like you are the right person to tell this story, given all of those experiences.
Maybe.
So I'll close with one more question. What's your next project? What are you working on now?
Well, I actually got a sabbatical for my next project, which was in January of 2019, to do a book on McCarthyism in Maine. There's actually some local stories and some state stories, not just the Margaret Chase Smith story, but also loyalty oaths and the role of school teachers and whatnot. Unfortunately for my research, that's when I got elected to the state legislature and was not able to do much research on that project. But as I enter my last year at Farmington, this has now become a retirement project. So I do intend to keep at it.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait to see what comes out of that project.
Me too.
And I hope there's something here that you can see.
There undoubtedly is.
Okay, so that concludes the interview portion of this presentation. Thank you again, Alison, for all of the information that you've given us. We already have questions rolling into the chat, so I think what I'd like to do is just stop the recording and I can read these questions to you, and then once those have finished, we can open it up to everyone else who's here. How does that sound?
Should I stop sharing the screen so we can see?
Yeah, that would be a good time. So I'll say a final thank you and I'll stop recording.